Welcome to the 7th session of our series on the Byzantine Empire, and today I want to talk about the recovery of the Byzantine Empire from the undeniably difficult times of the 6th and 7th centuries. However, I want to cover a period of over 300 years, and that requires either a lot of skipping or a certain focus. What I will do is to focus myself on this lady here. This is the Empress Irene, not just the wife of an emperor, but an empress in her own right, rather like Catherine the Great of Russia, the only female sovereign of the Byzantine Empire, the only female sovereign of the entirety of Roman history from 753 BC all the way down to 1453. I want to focus on her because she comes at the beginning of the long recovery, or she comes near to the beginning of the long recovery, and speaking about her allows me to pull in various threads which would otherwise be more or less disconnected. So let us start with this overview of her origins. Irene was born into an important local family in Athens in 752. She was born more than 2 centuries after the Empress Theodora, indeed nearly 3 centuries after the Empress Theodora, the last really important female character in Byzantine history. And in that 3-century period, as I said last week, the empire has changed beyond recognition. Theodora, the last really important woman in Byzantine history, had been born in Constantinople in the late 5th century, and she was born in the world of late antiquity. Constantinople, although by far the largest city in the Mediterranean world with its population of about 1 million, was only the largest of some very large other cities. There was Rome itself, there was Alexandria, there was Antioch, there were many other cities. And Theodora was born into a city which was dominated by a senatorial aristocracy, which often drew its family origins from the west, from Rome, and Constantinople itself was ruled by a Latin-speaking bureaucracy and by a bilingual senatorial aristocracy, and by a church, of course, which was monolingual in Greek. 300 years later, roughly speaking, Irene was born in Athens, which had by now shrunk to the size of a small market town, and all the other cities of the empire had shrunk either to nothing at all. So many cities had simply been abandoned. Or, if you look at Constantinople itself, of course the great city still exists, but it's not as great as it has been. Its population may have fallen from about 1 million in the early years of Theodora to perhaps 70 or 80,000 people. The great walls built by Theodosius still protect the city, but most of the city is empty. Much of it is given over to market gardening. The city itself consists of a shriveled ceremonial centre filled with elderly buildings, often in rather poor repair, and around those you have a cluster of what amounts to small villages, the inhabitants drawing their sustenance from the farming land within the city. Because of the continual plagues that sweep across the Mediterranean world, that indeed sweep across the planet, the city is continually cold, and it's probably the case that hardly anybody in the city of Constantinople has roots there going back more than 3 generations. As far as the use of Latin is concerned, that has entirely vanished. The empire is now purely Greek. Latin is a foreign language known to a few scholars and of course known to those officials whose job it is to deal with the Pope and the Western barbarians. That is the empire into which Irene is born. But, as I said last week, the empire is recovering. It is recovering partly through its own efforts. It's also recovering partly as a result of circumstances beyond its control and indeed beyond the knowledge of anybody before the past century. We can see that the dip in the 6th century of the empire was largely brought on by a dip in global temperatures. Temperatures didn't fall by much, they didn't fall by enough for you or me to notice, but they fell by enough for plants and animals to notice, and that brought on various kinds of environmental and population crises that seemed to reduce the world population by about a third, maybe 40%. The Mediterranean world suffered in this fall, and of course the empire suffered in this fall. After a certain date, and it's impossible to say exactly when because the data we have all tends to point to different times within a spectrum of about a century. But let us say from about 750, the cooling period comes to an end, and it's replaced by a great upswing. You can see that on the graph in the top right of this slide. The red area is known as the medieval warm period, which here seems to start around 700, but I'm not going to argue about it. 700, 750, it doesn't much matter. What does matter is that during the 8th century, global temperatures began to recover, and then they continued rising, and they seem to have peaked twice in the Middle Ages at levels considerably above where they are at the moment. What this means is the opposite of the cooling. It extends the growing period for food. It also increases the yield of the land. So you have longer growing seasons, better harvests, and partly as a consequence of this, after about 750, you have an end of the 20 or 30-year cycles of attacks of the bubonic plague. This, of course, leads to growing populations within the empire. It leads to a corresponding recovery in the West, which is now dominated by the Franks in alliance with the Pope. Because there is an increase in population, there is an increase in trade. Therefore, the city, Constantinople, begins to grow again, and the Golden Horn is beginning to fill again with ships from all over the Mediterranean world and indeed all over the Black Sea world. That means that the Golden Horn has to be dredged, and all of the often disused port installations must now be put back into use. We also have the beginning of much more settled relations with the northern barbarians. These have so far made their appearance in our story as raiders or as full-scale invaders. From now on, these barbarians settle down into a more civilized kind of life, and they are open to conversion to Orthodox Christianity, or where they don't convert to Orthodox Christianity, they're open to conversion to Catholic Christianity. The Arabs, they're a continuing menace, and their raids and occasional captures of islands continue to dot the narrative of events, but they're not at all the existential threat they had been before the second siege of Constantinople in 717. Irene is born at the beginning of a new chapter in the history of the empire and indeed the history of the world. Nobody at the time could see it, and I'm sure that nobody afterwards thought in a very connected way about it, but it is the beginning of a new age of economic and urban expansion. As far as recovery is concerned, a lot of our evidence is fairly recent, and it comes from the analysis of farming in southern Italy. One of the growth areas in modern archaeology is not digging up tombs of pharaohs filled with gold and other pretty things. It's a matter of carefully lifting away top layers of soil and getting yourself down to the level of the soil as it probably was at a certain time in the past, and then carefully taking out samples of the soil to see what kind of pollen is in it, and therefore what kind of crops were grown at that particular time. Looking at the results from southern Italy, what we can see is evidence for a growth of the area of cultivated land in all the various regions that have been surveyed. What that indicates is a growth in population. Further archaeology has given us evidence of the industrial manufacture of ceramic transport pots, which is further evidence for a recovery of trade. We know from the literature that there is a great increase in the incidence of Arab piracy at this time, which you might take as evidence of continuing weakness in the empire, so far as it is not able to stop these raids. Or you can see it as evidence for a recovery. There is no point for pirates to raid a shoreline where nobody lives and where there's nothing to steal. The more there is to steal, the more thieves you'll have. What we can see is a growth in the cultivation of cash crops and a growth in seaborne trade, and this is almost certainly evidence of a general recovery in the imperial economy. Let us come back to Irene. So she was born at the beginning of an age of renewed expansion. In 768, when she was still quite young, she was brought from Athens to Constantinople by the Emperor Constantine V, and there she was married to his son, Leo, on the 17th of December. She may have been the winner of a bride show, which is one of the more interesting customs of Byzantine imperial life. When an emperor wanted a wife for his son, he would send through the empire and have all of the most beautiful women rounded up and brought to Constantinople. There they would stand in a line, rather like a police suspect identification line, and the young man, with his father beside him, would walk up and down, sometimes touching one of the ladies, sometimes asking her to open her mouth so he could look at her teeth, sometimes talking to one and listening to her reply. It's possible that Irene was part of one of these bride shows and that she won it. She was married to the emperor's son. And then 2 years later, she gave birth to the future Constantine VI. In 775, about 7 years after this marriage, Constantine V died, and his son was crowned as Leo VI, with Irene as his empress. I haven't said anything about the iconoclast controversy. It's another of those religious disputes that seem to us rather opaque. Remember that although early Islam had no noticeable prejudice against human representations, this prejudice did eventually emerge. And those Byzantine statesmen who wanted to find a reason to explain the success of the Arabs and the long failure of the empire against the Arabs decided that God was looking unfavourably upon the empire because the churches throughout the empire were filled with icons, with representations of the saints and of Christ and of the Virgin, whereas the Arabs tended not to allow any kind of representations of human beings. Therefore, it seemed a good idea that if you wanted to save the empire, if you wanted to make the empire great again, the best thing to do would be to strip the churches of their icons and to have a somewhat more austere kind of Christianity. Since for most people the icons were not simply representations of the holy, but were holy in themselves, this led to a long controversy and a long period of political instability within the empire. The controversy had largely died down by the late 8th century, but it seems that Leo VI was a bit of an iconoclast. He was tolerant of those people who did not share his views, but he was hostile to the use of icons in worship. Irene, on the other hand, was strongly convinced of the efficacy of icons in worship. In 780, Leo VI took a much harder line than he had so far done against icons, and he died almost at once, and the rumour went round, probably not an unjustified rumour, that he had been poisoned by his wife. At this point, Irene takes power for herself. She installs her son as the next emperor, but he's only 9, and so she announces that she will be the regent. It's not unprecedented for a woman to be the regent, and so nobody thinks very much of that. But Irene makes sure to secure her position in a very effective way. If you come to power, and if you want to have power rather than simply to hold office, you need to take a good look at all of the agents of your state, all of the people who will execute your policies. You need to make that list. You need to make 2 lists indeed. In one list go all of those people who are your allies or who are likely to be your allies, and in the other list you need to put all the people who are not and will not be your allies, and then you need to get rid of all of the people in that second list. You must remove from office anyone who is likely to get in your way as you exercise power. That is what Irene did. She went through the imperial family, removing all of her husband's relatives from any position of influence. She had some of them ordained as priests, which made them ineligible to hold any civil office, and then just to make sure that everybody knew that they had been ordained and were ineligible, she ordered them to celebrate Mass in Hagia Sophia on Christmas Day in 780, and you can date the beginning of her reign from Christmas Day 780. Notice that she didn't kill her enemies, and the reason for that is that although Roman politics in the imperial period were often rather bloody, the only way to get rid of a rival claimant for the purple was to kill him. By the middle of the 8th century, the Byzantine Empire has become rather reluctant to use the death penalty. Instead of killing political opponents, the custom now is to make them ineligible to mount any kind of challenge. Ordaining them as priests or monks, that's a favourite way. If that isn't likely to be successful, or if the church is not likely to want to receive these people, the next best way is to blind them, which is, of course, a horrible thing to do, but it's arguably less brutal than killing them. Irene, therefore, has all of her enemies received into the church, or rather she pushes them into the church, thereby ensuring that they will be ineligible to hold any kind of secular office. She replaces these people with ministers who are loyal to her. The most notable of these is Tarasius, who was appointed Patriarch of Constantinople in 785. Also Stauracius, a eunuch, whom she appointed her foreign secretary and her chief general. Once Irene was firmly in power, she set about ending the iconoclast controversy. She set about ending it on terms that were entirely favourable to her. She wants to restore icons to worship throughout the empire. She has the power, she has the general support of the people, at least the people in Constantinople. Her difficulty is that she still has some in-laws who are iconoclasts and whom she hasn't entirely removed. But the other problem is that in the country districts from where the soldiers are recruited, remember those peasant militias who form the backbone of the Byzantine military, are not particularly favourable to the use of icons. So in 784, Irene summoned a council of bishops. She summoned a church council to discuss the restoration of icons, but the army mutinied. The army prevented the council from meeting. Irene's response? She declared war on the Arabs, not a war that she had any intention of fighting, and sent the entire army south to the border, where it spent a few years doing absolutely nothing. While the army was safely away, doing nothing very much, she called the Seventh Ecumenical Council to Nicaea, a city just across the straits on the Asian side, and there she procured a formal condemnation of iconoclasm, and this was the last church council which has the full acceptance of the Greek and Latin churches, the 7 ecumenical councils which are mentioned in the preamble to the Book of Common Prayer. Here on the right is a representation from rather late in Byzantine history of Irene and her son presiding over the final session of the 7th Ecumenical Council, or the Second Council of Nicaea. It is possible that after her death, for a long time, Irene was venerated as a saint. I don't believe that she is a normal part, however, of the Orthodox calendar. Here on the left is a gold solidus showing Irene alongside her son. Quite unusual for a regent to show herself on the empire's coinage, but Irene is not an ordinary regent. Notice, by the way, that the solidus, which was first brought in by Diocletian at the beginning of the 4th century, slightly modified by Constantine, is still being minted 400 years later at exactly the same standard, but that is an aside. Irene has established herself as the supreme power in the empire. Officially, she's only the regent for her son, but her son is a little boy, therefore she is in charge. She's in charge because she's removed everybody who might challenge her power, and she's replaced those with men who are absolutely loyal to her. She has settled a long-running religious controversy which has brought on periods of political instability within the empire. Therefore, the empire is internally at peace. It has an undivided government at the top. There is a growing population and growing wealth. Therefore, why not reach out and take back some of the territories which have been lost? This doesn't mean an invasion of Syria in order to retake it from the Arabs. It certainly doesn't mean any attempt on Egypt. In the first instance, it means the recovery of western and northern Greece, which had been lost in the previous centuries to the Slavic barbarians. These had cut the long road that ran all the way between Constantinople and Ravenna, and this had contributed to the drifting apart of the Greek and Latin churches. Irene began the process of reconquest. It was a slow but steady reconquest, not marked by immense military victories and the sudden gaining of great stretches of territory. It was a slow move forward. The idea was that a piece of territory would be taken from the barbarians. It would not be cleared of barbarians, and again, I'm treading on rather hot and unstable ground here. It would not be cleared of Slavic barbarians. Instead, these would be converted to Orthodox Christianity, and then they would be persuaded by various means to learn Greek. And the Greek they would learn was the Greek of Constantinople, from which modern Greek is the most direct and obvious descendant. I say in the slide that there is some controversy about the extent of demographic change in Greece caused by the Slavic invasions. There were German scholars in the 19th century who insisted that the modern Greeks were almost entirely the descendants of Slavic barbarians. And as I said last week, if you go to northern Greece and western Greece, you will see people who look broadly Central European. The Greeks, of course, insist that they are the direct genetic descendants of the ancient Greeks, of Homer and Pericles. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. There was a degree of demographic replacement in the early Middle Ages, and there was a period of reconquest by the empire in which Slavs were gradually, over the course of a few centuries, turned into Greeks. This reconquest began the process of the recovery of Greece for the empire and the re-establishment of what you can call Greek civilization within the historic territory of Greece. And Irene laid the foundations for the much more substantial and permanent reconquest of Greece by her successor Nicephorus I between 802 and 811. Equally, the Bulgarians, who had settled just south of the Danube, were not conquered, and they certainly weren't expelled, but they were gradually brought within the orbit of Orthodox Christianity. Not turned into Greeks, but turned into Orthodox Christians who continued to speak their Slavonic language. As far as the Arabs are concerned, I keep on saying they're not a problem. After the great disaster of 717, after the second siege of Constantinople, where they had been thrown back with catastrophic losses, the Arabs went into a long period of decadence. Around 750, the capital was moved from Damascus, which is a stone's throw from the Mediterranean Sea, and not that very far from Constantinople, all the way down to Baghdad, a long way from the Mediterranean world, where Islamic civilization came increasingly under Persian influence. The Caliphate is becoming politically weaker. The Islamic world is breaking up into autonomous and semi-autonomous regions, often more interested in fighting each other than in pulling together to fight some external enemy. The Arabs are not a serious problem. They have become decadent. But there are very good permanent diplomatic and commercial relations between the empire and the caliphate. These great empires are mostly at peace, and as with Byzantium and Persia before, they now regard each other as equals, and they regard peace with each other as the normal state of affairs and war as an interruption of business as usual. Here is a map showing the facts that I've described. There is the Caliphate, which on the map is a gigantic empire, but it is largely broken up into autonomous and semi-autonomous regions. You can see that Baghdad is a long way from the Mediterranean. It's much closer to the Persian Gulf. It is much more interested in India and in China and in the islands of the Indian Ocean and even in East Africa than it is nowadays in the Mediterranean world. Therefore, for all manner of reasons, the Arabs cease to be a danger to the empire. Irene is able to direct her efforts towards the recovery of Greece and the peaceful conversion of the northern barbarians to Orthodox Christianity, after which they can be brought into the orbit of Byzantine civilization as allies or as satellites, but they will certainly not be more than occasional enemies of the empire. This is a revival which is going on all over the world, and it is also taking place in Western Europe. The barbarian invasions of Western Europe in the 5th century were probably not great catastrophic floods of people. It seems to have been relatively small bands of invaders and then settlers, 10, 20,000 at a time, and they largely entered what appears to have been a demographic vacuum. There was a loss of population in Western Europe even before the great climatic disasters of the 6th century. The barbarians entered the Western Empire, they replaced the Western Empire, they were then gradually converted to Catholicism. The spoken language of most people in Western Europe continued to be Latin. The exception was England, where there was a substantial replacement of peoples, or at least there appears to have been a substantial replacement of peoples, certainly of language and culture, but in mainland Europe, most people continue to speak Latin. The ruling classes, the barbarians, they eventually forgot their own Germanic languages and they adopted Latin, not the Latin of Cicero and Virgil, but the spoken Latin of the empire, which continued to change and to simplify and to evolve towards the modern Romance languages, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, etc. For several centuries, Western Europe went through a low period, a period of low population and of limited economic activity. But again, with the ending of the cooling period and the beginning of the medieval warming period, the West also recovers. You have the rise of the Catholic Franks to domination over Western Europe, not of Spain and not yet of Italy. You have a number of political and dynastic shifts which lead at the beginning of the 8th century to the emergence of Charles Martel, whose official title is Master of the Palace, the hereditary Prime Minister of the Franks, but he is the effective ruler of the Frankish realms. He ruled as unofficial king after 737. In 749, the Pope decided that this hereditary balance between an all-powerful mayor of the palace and a king who had no power at all was unsatisfactory. He therefore persuaded Pepin, the son of Charles, to depose the last of the Merovingian kings and to declare himself the king of the Franks. There is a representation, by the way, of the Battle of Tours in 732. Remember, the Arabs conquered North Africa after the 660s. They then got across the Straits of Gibraltar in 711 and took out the whole of Spain, except a few Christian principalities in the north, which eventually started a process of reconquest, but that's a long time in the future. The Arabs then, in the 720s, began to move across the Pyrenees into southern France. Their obvious intention was to continue the process of conquest, which had begun in the 630s. However, at the Battle of Tours, Charles Martel put a final end to Islamic expansion into Western Europe. Charlemagne, the son of Pepin, succeeded his father as king of the Franks in 768. He ended the internal disorder within the Frankish realms. He also ended the threat in the north and the east from the unchristianized barbarians. His empire is that blue area covering the whole of France, Belgium, Holland, a great chunk of Germany, deep into Austria, much of Western and Central Europe. It also includes this green area in the south, the Kingdom of Italy. That's an important part of our story, but I'll come to that. He presided over a very significant cultural revival. The main part of this was a project of transmission. We have lost a great deal more of Latin than of Greek literature. Greek literature was for the most part kept safe in the great libraries of Constantinople, although the Byzantine Empire went through what is sometimes called a dark age. The libraries were simply emptied of people. They were not emptied of books. The books remained there, getting dustier and dustier, sometimes attacked by damp, occasionally by mice, but never disintegrating, ready to be taken down from the shelves when the time was more propitious. In the West, the great disasters of the 6th century had been more, the 6th century had been more catastrophic in the West, especially in terms of the Roman cultural heritage. The libraries were burned, the libraries were ruined. Those libraries that were not burned were smashed up, and the books were left out in the rain. The church took in as many books as it could and rebound them, recopied some of them, put them on shelves. The church did a good job, but the church was forced to choose, and we have lost something like 97% of the classical literature that an educated Roman of before the 6th century would have expected to have on the shelves of a well-stocked library. Charlemagne came along towards the end of the 8th century, and he began a consistent state-directed project of recovery. The remaining books were taken down from their shelves, and even as they were disintegrating from age, they were recopied, and they were put into a state where they could be taken down again in the 13th and 14th centuries in Italy for the great revival of learning. Without Charlemagne, there would have been no Renaissance in Europe, because virtually the whole of classical literature, or perhaps the whole of classical literature, would already have disappeared beyond any hope of recall. Part of this involves the development of a new writing script, no longer the great block capitals of the Romans, but lowercase letters. You have the introduction of spacing between words and the introduction of punctuation, which makes reading a great deal easier, and among much else, it makes the copying of texts a great deal easier, because no longer is a relatively uneducated scribe trying to make sense of great strings of letters that he is not able to read particularly well. Now it's a matter of glancing at the page, reading it, and then making a fair copy of it. On the left, you have representations, probably representations from the life of some of the great men of the period. There is Alcuin of York, who was invited by Charlemagne to oversee this process of cultural recovery. And there you have Paul the Deacon, one of the greatest historians of the Middle Ages. I believe there is, in Penguin Classics, a good modern translation of his History of the Lombards. Well worth reading, I can say. I did produce a reading copy of Paul the Deacon some years ago for A-level students of Latin, and it was a very enjoyable job. The Only thing I found difficult about making the selections was making the selections, because it's very difficult to decide to leave something out. It is an age in the West of cultural recovery and of renewed cultural creation. You can no longer talk about the Western kingdoms as barbarian kingdoms. Look at these pictures on this slide. There is Aachen Cathedral, built by Charlemagne around 800. Look at that. You can say, but many of the columns were taken from Ravenna. Much of that beautiful craftsmanship is recycled, late Roman work. Yes, it may well have been recycled, but it's been recycled with taste. It was not simply a matter of gathering up anything that looked moderately pretty and not too broken down, shoving it all together and saying, look, I've built a cathedral. This is a work of great architecture, and if it incorporates materials recycled from the past, that is only part of its greatness. Or look at Lorsch Abbey, built around 764 in West Germany. Looking at these surviving buildings, you can no longer talk about Western barbarians. These are medieval Europeans. Again, this is some of the artwork produced during the time of Charlemagne. On the right, you have a representation of Charlemagne himself. I'll repeat, you cannot talk of these people as barbarians. They were poor in ways that we can barely understand. There were not that many of them. The cities were not large. There was limited trade. But they are not barbarians. They have overseen a recovery of civilization that would continue to grow. Charlemagne's expansion into Italy. A rather tangled story. But in 751, the Lombards, who had taken over most of Italy, completed their conquest of the north of Italy. They took Ravenna, and that brought an end to imperial control over any part of northern Italy. The Lombards had taken Ravenna with the assistance of the Pope. In 772, Pope Adrian I asked the Lombard king to hand over some of the cities from the former exarchate of Ravenna. It seems that the Pope and the Lombards had collaborated in the expulsion of the Byzantines from northern Italy. The Lombards, who had provided most of the muscle, then decided that they would keep all the spoils. A long period of wheedling by the popes. But then in 772 the Pope made a formal demand for his share of the loot. The response of the Lombard king was to invade papal territory. The Pope then asked Charlemagne for help. The Franks and the popes had long been close allies because the Franks were the first of all the barbarians to convert to Catholicism. The Lombards then sent an embassy to Constantinople, asking the emperor for help. The fact that they had recently been at war with the empire was something they hoped the empire would overlook. The emperor might have been inclined to help because he didn't really want a very strong power anywhere in Italy, because the empire still controls large parts of southern Italy and doesn't want those to come under pressure. But the emperor is busy elsewhere and is unable to assist. Charlemagne then marches into Italy with no opposition except for the Lombards. He conquers the whole kingdom of Lombardy and incorporates it into his empire. Or perhaps I shouldn't say that. He didn't incorporate northern Italy into the Frankish Empire. He didn't incorporate northern Italy into the Frankish realms. He simply became king of Italy as well as king of the Franks. So Charlemagne is now the big man in northern Italy. And there is one more step. This comes in 799. Rome at this period was an unsettled city. You have an ungovernable Roman nobility. This gets into dispute with the Pope over who controls the city, and they grab hold of the Pope and try to blind him. He escapes, but is wounded. He appeals to Charlemagne for help. Charlemagne thinks about this. Does he really want to take over the papal territories as well? But he's advised by Alcuin of York, you really have no choice. You must help the Pope. If you don't help him now, you will lose face in Italy and in Christendom in general. Charlemagne enters Rome in 799. He ends the disorder. He hangs the ringleaders among the Roman nobility. He puts the Pope back on the papal throne, and as one does, he then insisted that the Pope should swear fealty to him. The Pope is now his man. This was not what the Pope had in mind when he asked for assistance. The Pope is the supreme bishop. The Pope is the universal bishop. The Pope is no one's feudal underling. The Pope floats with the whole Catholic Church above the political disputes of Western Christendom. Being forced by circumstances to swear fealty to the King of the Franks is not something that was at all on his agenda. The Pope's response is something that determined the shape of Western Europe for about the next 1,000 years. Before we come to that, however, let's go back to Irene. It's 788. Young Constantine, the official emperor, is now a young man. He's tired of being ruled by his mother. She won't give up power. She says, no, I'm doing a very good job. You carry on hunting and womanizing and doing whatever young men do. Leave the boring business of governing this empire to me. Constantine is not fobbed off by that. So in 788, he stages a palace coup. He arrests his mother and her advisors. He removes them from power, and he rules with the support of the army. However, Constantine VI is not as lucky as his mother. In 791, he begins a series of unlucky wars with the Bulgarians and the Caliphate, and he's increasingly unpopular within the empire, and so he feels compelled to restore his mother to power. But there are continuing strains within the family. Irene then decides to settle matters once and for all. She arrests her son. Her intention is to blind him, thereby making him ineligible to rule. But the blinding goes wrong, and Constantine dies 3 days later, which is unfortunate. It was not her intention. I'm quite sure that she would kill her son. She is a mother after all, and she only wants to blind him and put him away somewhere. But with the death of her son, Irene can no longer be the regent for her son. She has no choice. She declares herself emperor. Emperor in her own right. Not empress, but emperor. She's accepted as legitimate by the church and by the empire as a whole. She's popular. She has lost some degree of popularity because killing her son is taken as maybe a step too far, but she has ended the iconoclast controversy, and so she's popular within the church and within the empire as a whole, so she rules as unchallenged emperor. But you see, the Pope repudiates her at once. The Pope is a Westerner, and the Western barbarians do not believe that women should be in positions of leadership. That is a man's job. A man has to go out and fight in battle, and a king is supposed to go out and fight in battle at the head of his armies. A woman, therefore, is ineligible by virtue of her sex. The Pope repudiates Irene, says that she is not a true emperor. She cannot, by definition, be an emperor. Therefore, the imperial throne is vacant. This is regarded within the empire as a somewhat eccentric view of matters. But Charlemagne also is reluctant to give full recognition to a woman as the Roman emperor. He's not willing to do anything about it. It's just a matter of being somewhat evasive when envoys turn up from Constantinople. But this now sets us up for the next move. Remember, Charlemagne has saved the Pope, and he's required the Pope to swear fealty to him. The Pope doesn't like this because he is above the kings of Western Europe. In 800, on Christmas Day 800, Charlemagne is still in Rome, settling matters there. He attends the Mass in St. Peter's. While kneeling at the altar, the Pope creeps up behind him and crowns him Roman Emperor. According to his biographer Einhard, Charlemagne was taken by surprise. He was not pleased by the Pope's action. The Pope has erased that oath of fealty. The Pope may have sworn fealty to the King of the Franks and the King of Italy, but the Pope has now crowned Charlemagne as the Emperor. That abolishes the oath of fealty. The Pope is the one who has put the crown on Charlemagne's head, therefore the Pope stands above Charlemagne again. The Pope is the man who creates the Emperor. The Pope has made Charlemagne and his successors subject to papal coronation and papal recognition. So Charlemagne wasn't terribly pleased by this, but it raises a further problem. Remember, the Pope and the West in general have not recognised Irene as the legitimate emperor. They've declared that the imperial throne is vacant. But now Charlemagne has been crowned emperor, and let me quote James Bryce, whose book, The Holy Roman Empire, is well worth reading. When Odoacer compelled the abdication of Romulus Augustulus in 476, he did not abolish the Western Empire as a separate power, but caused it to be reunited with or sink into the Eastern, so that from that time there was a single undivided Roman Empire again. Pope Leo III and Charlemagne, like their predecessors, held the Roman Empire to be one and indivisible, and proposed by the coronation of Charlemagne not to proclaim a severance of the East and West. They were not revolting against a reigning sovereign, but legitimately filling up the place of the deposed Constantine VI. Charlemagne was held by the Pope and by the Western kings to be the legitimate successor not of Romulus Augustulus, the last of the Western emperors, but of Constantine VI, and therefore to be the legitimate successor of Constantine the Great, and through him of Augustus. The Pope was proclaiming Charlemagne not as the Emperor of the West, but as the Roman Emperor, as the Emperor of all the realms that were or that had been within the Roman Empire. As such, Charlemagne was the true Emperor of Byzantium as well. This opened immediate diplomatic complications with the Byzantine Empire. The imperial government in Constantinople, headed by Irene, immediately rejected the legitimacy of Charlemagne as any kind of Roman emperor, and for several centuries thereafter, the emperors in Constantinople formally sneered at the idea of a Western emperor. But the Western emperors do continue. They continue all the way down to 1806, when the Holy Roman Empire was abolished by Napoleon. Indeed, until the Paris Treaties in 1919, it was still necessary for the Pope to receive approval on his election from the Habsburg Emperor. Western Europe was shaped for many centuries by the conflict between these two rival powers, the Pope and the Emperor, each claiming ultimate sovereignty. The Pope was the universal bishop. The Pope indeed could depose rulers if he thought that they had forfeited their right to rule, as the Pope claimed in 1570 in the bull of excommunication against Elizabeth I. The Emperor, however, claimed that he was the direct successor of Constantine, of the 13th Apostle, and therefore that he was the ultimate authority in Europe. Now that's in the future. At the moment, you have a Roman emperor in Italy, Charlemagne, whose ministers claim that he is the lawful emperor, not only in the West, but also of Byzantium. And you have the emperor in Constantinople, who just happens to be a woman, Irene, neither recognizing the other as the lawful emperor. There are proposals which Charlemagne was quite happy to entertain, and Irene seems to have been happy to entertain, of a marriage between Charlemagne and Irene. This didn't come to anything, but that would have been an interesting solution to this diplomatic complexity. It didn't come about, and Irene's days are now numbered. Killing her son, as I said, was a step too far. She's now in her late 40s, which is quite old by the standards of the day. She is no longer quite so effective as emperor as she had been as regent. In 802, there's a palace coup, and one of her ministers, her finance minister, Nicephorus, replaces her as emperor. Irene accepts the deposition. Again, Byzantine politics, by today's standards, are somewhat irregular, but they are rather gentle by historical standards. Irene has been deposed as emperor, but she's not put to death. She's sent off to a monastery in Lesbos, where she dies in 803, possibly of stomach cancer. She had been a ruthless and capable ruler. You can put her on a list of great women rulers, and I've given a list here. Hatshepsut, one of the Egyptian pharaohs, Cleopatra, Elizabeth I, Catherine the Great, Margaret Thatcher. You may not like her, but she was undoubtedly effective. Irene is in any list of capable female rulers. Her significance, apart from the fact that she was a female emperor, is that she put in place that combination of internal and external policies that would restore the empire as the greatest power in the Mediterranean world. Let's skip forward 150 years now to 950. There, in the bottom right, you have a map showing the restored empire. It is only about a quarter of the empire as it had been ruled by Constantine, but given the changed circumstances of the age, given that Syria and Egypt and North Africa are now part of the Islamic world, and given that the West is governed by more or less capable Western emperors, the empire has recovered as well as it can. You have a limited recovery of Syria. The empire is not interested in incorporating territories with large Islamic populations because it is not, as I keep on saying, a multi-ethnic, multinational, multilingual empire, as the Roman Empire had been. It is something that is worth calling a Greek Orthodox nation-state. But the empire has restored itself as the greatest power in the Mediterranean world. And although it's not interested in formal conquest of any Islamic territory, it has become effectively the dominant power in much of the Islamic world. Indeed, Egypt is now a satellite of the empire because, for various climatic reasons and for various reasons of substantial misrule in Egypt by the Islamic government, Egypt is unable to feed its people. It is unable to grow enough corn to feed its own population. It's no longer the great breadbasket of the Mediterranean. It is unable to feed itself, and it's kept alive largely by shipments of corn from the southern Ukraine through Constantinople across to Egypt. So the empire is a great power again. You have a cultural revival, which I'll discuss next week. You then have the projection of soft power. And let's talk about Russia. 988. That is the conventional date given for the conversion of Russia to Christianity. There had been much missionary activity before by both the Greek and the Latin churches, but 988 is the key date. Vladimir of Ukraine, sometimes known as Saint Vladimir, sometimes known as Vladimir the Damned. I suppose it's a matter of from what perspective you view him. A pagan ruler, famous for cruelty and treachery and drunkenness. 800 concubines and wives, and he spent much of his time when not fighting wars in hunting and feasting. But Vladimir was a man who looked to the future, and he wanted to unite his people under a single faith. The question is, which faith? He sent out envoys throughout the civilized world to look for a suitable faith. He rejected Islam and Judaism because of their dietary restrictions. He rejected Islam because of its prohibition of alcohol. Catholic Christianity, he found that rather inconvenient, not least because he would need to deal with the Pope. Envoys then came back from Constantinople with this account of what they saw in Hagia Sophia. We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth, for surely there is no such splendour or beauty anywhere on earth. We cannot describe it to you. We only know that God dwells there among men, and that their service surpasses the worship of all other places. So Vladimir said, orthodoxy, that's the one. And there's a representation of the mass baptism of his nobility. He made them all strip off, jump into the water. They were baptized Christians. And from that time, Ukraine and then Russia were parts of the Orthodox world. A matter of immense and continuing significance. Have a look at this map. This is a religious map of Europe around the year 1100, at the time of the Great Schism in 1054. The orangey areas are conjecturally, not entirely, but the orangey areas have been taken by Catholic Christendom. The blue areas have been taken by Orthodox Christendom. There is a race between both branches of Christianity towards the Arctic Circle, and the question is who will get there first. The enormous significance of this is partly that you have rivalry brought on by competing missionary activity between the Orthodox and Catholic churches, which largely brings on the great split of 1054, where each church excommunicated the other. There's some doubt over exactly what happened, but that's taken as the date of the Great Schism, the formal division of Christendom into two competing blocks. But the more immediate significance of this is that Constantinople is the head not only of an empire, the Byzantine Empire, it is also the head of a great Orthodox commonwealth which stretches far beyond the borders of the empire, right up towards the Arctic Circle, taking in all of the Eastern Slavs. And the significance of this is that the empire no longer faces any serious threats from the north. It means that the empire is no longer seen by the northern barbarians as a rather nice place to invade and to plunder. It is seen as the head of their faith, and the emperor is seen as the man who has a vague supervisory capacity over all of the Slavic kings. The final triumph of the empire comes during the long reign of Basil II, who died in 1025, one of the great military emperors. He secured all of the borders of the empire and surrounded those borders with satellite states or with allies. He secured imperial control over the whole of southern Italy. He extended imperial power back to the Danube frontier, incorporating the Bulgarian kingdom into the empire. He presided over the final expansion of the empire. As I said, it's a fragment of the great empire that Constantine had ruled, but it is, as I keep on saying, the richest and most powerful state in the Mediterranean world, and it has no enemies. All of its enemies have been vanquished. The Arabs to the south and the east are of no particular significance. If the empire wanted, it could reach out and retake the whole of Syria, but it chooses not to because it would be inconvenient for the empire's internal balance. The empire is content to have subdued the Orthodox Christian Bulgarians and to have secured imperial control over southern Italy. The empire dominates the eastern Mediterranean. There is no more piracy. There is no longer any threat from Islamic fleets. The empire is at peace on all its frontiers. The empire is filling up with people. The city itself is probably back to the same population as it had at the beginning of the reign of Justinian, and is now adorned with new and beautiful buildings. There is a full-scale cultural revival going on in Constantinople and in the other cities of the empire. Those cities are expanding. You have the further development of great industries within the empire, not great by the standards of the 18th century, but very substantial silk weaving and pottery making and carpet making and things of that nature. So the empire is rich, the empire is at peace, the empire is militarily supreme within its own world. It faces no enemies of any note. If in about 1025 you had stood on the sea walls of Constantinople looking over the massed fleets of trading ships, and if you turned back and looked over the vast glittering expanse of the imperial city, you could say that history had come to an end. The empire had been through a long period of tribulation, but that was now over. History was at an end, and nothing more would happen. Nothing could go wrong. But of course, history never comes to an end. When anyone says, that's the end, there has been a final triumph of our people, and the world will be like the present forever and ever and ever, perhaps a bit richer, perhaps different in some ways, but the shape of the world as it has now been established will endure forever and ever. When anybody says that, all you do is smile and think, just wait and see. And that's what you would have said in 1025 to that man who looked over the walls of Constantinople and over the city itself. History never does come to an end. The empire has undoubtedly restored itself, but nothing is forever. And next week we will talk about the renewed troubles of the 11th and 12th centuries. So that's all I have to say about that. I haven't left much time for questions, but I'll take a few if anybody has any.